know you, as I say, you're not shy in retiring. I'm sure that you will have some interesting and challenging things to throw at Anand, other obviously than tea tariffs, which we've already ruled out for this morning. So look, we should make a start, shouldn't we? So look. Some of you will know Anand. I think I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you back, Anand, to the City Region. And as we said yesterday, it's almost exactly 2 years ago that you came to talk to us about Brexit and what it may hold. We're a lot further on in some ways, but in other ways we're not. And Anand's back today at what's turning out to be yet again another pivotal moment in the future of the UK's economy and indeed our sovereignty. And I think that's an issue Anand will touch on. For those of you who don't know Anand, he's director of the award-winning think tank UK in a Changing Europe. His organisation's really seen as an authoritative source of independent research on UK and EU relations, which is very much why we've reached out to Anand to give us a really objective and non-politicised view on what's going on and what we might expect. And as you got a sense from last night, those of you who caught Question Time, Anand can regularly be seen and heard on TV and radio as an informed commentator on the UK and Europe. And I think if you've not seen him before, after today, you will understand why. And I have to say a particular thanks, as he did say when we had a chat yesterday morning, that if it hadn't been for us folks in Liverpool, given everything he had on and Question Time and everything else going on at the moment in this space, he would have had to have cancelled us, but he didn't want to let us down. I think that's probably the promise of copious red wine the next time he comes up here, courtesy of the Chief. So really grateful to you, Anand, for making the time. And also, if you watched Question Time last night, you'll have picked this up. Outside of the world of EU economy and politics, he's a huge football fan, enjoying Leeds United's pretty positive return to the Premiership. Certainly a healthy thrashing of my team, Everton. I know was brought to particular pleasure. So we've asked Anand today not so much to talk about football, although that may crop up, but really to talk about his view on what deal, if any, he expects on Europe in the coming days, what the implications are for the UK and for our city region, and what he thinks that we might be able to do as a business community to kind of mitigate or prepare for those challenges and possibly seize some of the opportunities that may be presented. So we have about another 50 minutes or so. We need to finish promptly at 12:30 because Anand is a man in demand. So what I would say is a couple of practical matters before we start. We will be recording this session. There's been quite a few businesses who've said, could we have access to it because they're not available? So we will record the session and we will make it available online for those who want to pick up the intel, or if you think of making notes or whatever, you're very welcome to have a copy of the recording. As usual, just keep your microphones on mute until you're ready to speak. Preferably keep your cameras on if you can, but no problem if you can't, or you have to step away from the camera for a few minutes. That's absolutely no problem. We will have lots of time for questions, hopefully about 20 to 30 minutes. So if you have a question, please either put it into the chat or raise your hand or wave at me, and we'll look to bring you in. So without any more to do, it is my huge pleasure to introduce to you Professor Anand Menon. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much. Hi, everyone. That is a top lockdown tip, isn't it? Which you have to turn your camera off before you stand up and walk away, because I've got caught in shorts a few times early on in lockdown until I learned the ropes. It's a very important first step. I'll talk for about 10 or 15 minutes in quite general terms. I'm sure you've got more specific questions. I can't guarantee I can answer your specific questions about the specific areas in which you trade, but I can do my best. I'll point you in the right direction to someone who might be able to answer it. I suppose the first thing is, will there be a deal? And the honest answer is, no one knows. I think actually we reached the point where Michel Barnier and David Frost don't know because it's no longer up to them. Ultimately, the Brexit negotiation is now going on in Boris Johnson's head, and he has to decide whether he's willing to make the compromises that everyone knows he's going to have to make in order for there to be a deal. The problem, it seems to me, is this: at the dinner last, whenever it was, a couple of days ago, what both sides did was lay down their position and made it absolutely clear that those positions are irreconcilable. And those positions come down to a fundamental clash of principle. And it is very hard, or I find it very hard to see, given that very fundamental clash of principle, how either side makes the concessions that we're going to have to see for them to get any overlap between their positions at all. There is absolutely no prospect of the European Union compromising on its level playing field demands. I don't think those demands are necessarily particularly sensible. I think the EU is being far, far too defensive, but that is their position. And the fact of the matter is, when it comes to trade, you will always find people who will lobby in favor of protectionism. It's generally far harder to find people who will lobby in favor of openness, because potential losers are quicker to get on the phone to politicians than a diffuse set of winners. So if you force me to guess, I think we are quite possibly heading towards a no-deal outcome. And if, as a follow-up question to that, you said to me, so why are they wasting their time talking then? I think it is partly so that they can both go back to their respective constituencies and say, we tried. We gave it anything. You know, we left it all on the pitch. We played the full 90 minutes. We didn't walk away. We did everything we possibly could. And I have to say that if at this point, for this reason, we end up without a deal, it's not a failure of negotiation. It is simply the fact that the two sides have irreconcilable principles on a fundamental point, which is, should a country that is leaving the European Union still be told that it has to follow certain rules in order to be able to trade with the European Union without tariffs? Now, the British government will say, well, come on, you do this for Canada, so why can't you do this for us? The simple answer is because you're a hell of a lot closer to us than Canada is. You're a bigger economy than Canada is. You trade with us far more than Canada does. And actually, there is an element of dishonesty about what the British government has said about these talks. To say we are only asking for a Canada deal is just not true. Canada didn't ask for a whole load of permits for lorry drivers, surprisingly enough, because there isn't that much lorry traffic between Canada and the European Union. Because we're close, the nature of our trade is very, very different. And the government's asked for far more than Canada wanted. We've asked, for instance, for mutual recognition of qualifications, which means that if you're a lawyer or an accountant or an architect, you can continue to work in the European Union with your British qualification, which is automatically recognised as equivalent by the European Union. The EU have said very firmly, no, that won't be the case, and that will have an impact. I mean, one thing worth saying is, even with a deal, even if we sign a deal, for services, there will be virtually nothing at all. If you're someone who travels on the back of professional qualifications to do your job in an EU country, you will no longer be able to do so from the 1st of January without A, ensuring that your qualification works over there, B, getting a visa, and C, if you're taking professional equipment with you, you'll probably have to pay a fee and register it. So the bottom line, I think, of this is, yes, it'll probably be no deal, though I'm very, very willing and very, very used to, in fact, being proved wrong. But even if there is a deal, and I think this is the bit that's getting lost from the debate now. Everyone's so obsessed with, oh my God, will he get a deal? Will he get a deal? That I think if Boris Johnson comes back with a deal, he'll be hailed as a sort of savior. The deal will have massive economic consequences for us, even if it's signed. The economic estimates for a deal say that it will impact on the British economy to the tune of 5 to 7% of our GDP over 10 years, which is huge, which is double the expected impact of the pandemic on our economy over the next 10 to 12 years, which is bigger than the impact of the financial crisis on our economy. So this is with a deal. There's going to be a lot of change. So let me just, I'll talk briefly about no deal and why I think it matters. I'll talk a bit about what happens with a deal and just reflect a little bit on the politics, then we can do questions. No deal is different to a deal. Why? Because we'll have to pay tariffs, because there'll be quotas, because the delays that we expect at the border in January will be far, far worse, because there'll be more checks and more paperwork. The forecasts, and we can talk about forecasts and whether you should believe them or not, say that a no deal outcome over 10 years probably means about -9% on GDP over that period. Let me be clear, -9% is growth foregone. It's not the economy will shrink by 9%. It is that the economy will be 9% smaller than it would have been had we remained within the European Union. And the importance of that distinction, I think, is that it's not politically necessarily a game changer, in the sense that growth foregone is far harder for voters to spot than growth lost. So it's not necessarily the case. You hear some people saying, but if he does this, he'll never win an election. Depends. The impact of Brexit will be severe, it will be large, but it will be subtle and it will be long term. It will not be as obvious as the economic impact of COVID come Easter next year if we have 3 million people unemployed. It will not be that striking and that obvious to voters. Manufacturing will get particularly badly hit under no deal because manufacturing is the area that gets most attention in the deal that is on the table. Northern Ireland will be particularly badly hit in the event of no deal. We've had this discussion about the customs border between GB and NI. That border becomes harder and the checks become more intrusive if there's no deal. Why? Because they're going to have to check for liability for tariffs on all the GB goods going into Northern Ireland in case they enter the European Union market. So there's a whole different layer of checks will be necessary on the border with Northern Ireland. Some people say, well, actually, in the greater scheme of things, we've got this COVID catastrophe going on anyway, no one's going to notice. I don't think that's true. And I don't think that's true for two reasons. Firstly, Brexit will impact on the economy very differently to COVID. So whilst COVID has hit retail, has hit hospitality, Brexit will hit agriculture and fresh food if there's no deal. It will hit manufacturing, particularly if there's no deal, and it's going to hit pharma very, very badly indeed. So the things we will notice if there are no deals straight away is food prices will go up. Price of imported food will go up. Tesco's have talked about a 5% increase across the board in the cost of your groceries. Things you're importing from continental Europe will be liable for tariffs. Things you're importing from continental Europe might not reach here because if it's fresh products and if there's a tailback at the ports, it's going to be hard to get those fresh products in while they're still fresh. The Cabinet Office was saying last week that their ballpark expectation on this side is 3,000 to 4,000 trucks being snarled at any given time. They say their worst case analysis is 7 to 8. Whether they can get those into the new lorry parks in time to keep the port moving, we don't know, but there will be disruption with or without a deal. It will be significantly worse without a deal because the French will have no interest in helping us out if we walk from the negotiations. I mean, that's one of the fundamental differences between the two. If we sign a trade deal, it's our trade deal and it's their trade deal. They will have as much interest as we do in selling it to their constituents as a good deal. If we get a trade deal, in other words, the French, the Belgians, the Dutch will, I think, be a bit flexible in implementing the new rules to try and keep things moving because they don't want their people saying, hang on a sec, what have you done to us? Okay. If there's no deal, it is probably in the interest of the European Union, not to put too fine a point on it, to make us bleed. If you look at the notices that the European Commission put out yesterday about transitional measures to keep the planes going, to keep the trucks going, right at the top of that document, it says, these measures do not exist to prevent all the negative fallout of Brexit, i.e., we want the British to feel some pain, but we're going to take some measures to mitigate the pain we feel in the short term. So if there's no deal, the European Union's primary objective is going to make us suffer enough to get us back to the negotiating table as quickly as possible. The other thing that happens with no deal then, if you think about it, is that political relations between us and the 27 deteriorate very, very quickly indeed. Because, of course, the logic of politics, if the talks break up, is that both sides go home and start blaming the other. So Boris Johnson will say, yep, there are queues. Yep, there are shortages. It's the bloody French. And the French will be doing the same thing to us. It'll be very, very hard for us to sit down and negotiate again in the short term because I suspect things are going to get very strained very quickly. So that's a no deal scenario. With a deal, well, as I said, services will be badly hit. Financial services will be badly hit. There's all sorts of non-economic areas where we're going to feel real consequences. Police cooperation is one area. We will almost certainly lose significant, if not all, access to police and crime databases. That means the DNA database, the passenger name recognition database, the Schengen Information System database that will warn us in advance of people with criminal records coming into our country. We will be blind from the 1st of January in the event that we lose access to those databases. And you know, if you Google police Brexit evidence, you will come up with reams of paper from senior police officers giving evidence to Parliament in which they say, you can't possibly do this to us. This is such an integral part of how we police this country, to collaborate with our European partners on the back of shared information. If you remove that information from us, policing gets far, far more difficult. And bear in mind that even in those bits of the economy that will be covered with a deal, there will still be an impact. Ford reckon they will be doing 115,000 customs declarations a year. The additional cost for aerospace has been estimated at £1.5 billion a year just through additional admin and paperwork. And if you think about the car industry, on average, there's about a £400 margin on a 15 grand car. So if you're paying additional paperwork as well, your margin is vanishing quite quickly. Obviously, if there's no deal, you're paying a 10% tariff on top of that, and your margin might disappear altogether. But my hunch is, for a variety of reasons, not just Brexit, but to do with, you know, the fate of diesel cars, to do with where companies are manufacturing electric cars. I don't think the future of the car industry in this country is bright at all, and Brexit makes it slightly less bright. I think the one thing that makes me think maybe they'll sign a deal is my hunch that politically getting a deal is easier for Boris Johnson than not. Because as I said, he can come back with that piece of paper, he can wave it around, he can be hailed as a hero, he can get the tabloid headlines, Boris does the impossible again. Labour will be skewered because Keir Starmer can't figure out whether to vote in favour of the deal or whether to abstain. And I'm pretty convinced the Labour Party in Parliament will be badly divided about this. So in terms of the optics, I think it is easier for Boris Johnson to sign a deal. That being said, and whisper it softly, it might just be that this is something he believes in, that he doesn't think we should be bound by European Union laws as a matter of principle, and so is simply unwilling to make that compromise. We won't know that until next week. It is remarkable in a way that we've come this far after 4 years, and basically everything hinges on what sort of mood Boris is on Monday morning. But ultimately, this is his call. The other thing I would say, which troubles me, is if we get a deal, it will be rammed through Parliament in 3 days. And the one lesson you learn from events this time last year with the withdrawal agreement is if you ram a big technical document through Parliament in 3 days, MPs end up signing something without reading it, and then 9 months later start saying, hang on a sec, you mean there are customs checks with Northern Ireland? No one told me that, even though it's there in the text that they signed up to last year, because no one had the time to scrutinize it properly. So one of the dangers of a deal, I think, is that we will put into law bad law, because no one is going to be able to read it, and it will miss out on that crucial committee stage where committees take evidence from experts about the text that is being signed, about its implications, and MPs get the chance to mull it over. So the whole thing, if I were to say the whole thing is suboptimal, let's just take that as a bit of an understatement. This is not the way you would ideally want to sort out your trading relations with your nearest and largest trading partner. The final thing I'd say, which is the regional point, is all the evidence suggests that both Brexit and COVID will impact most severely on those parts of the country that the Prime Minister is focusing on for his levelling up agenda. That is to say, we start off with very, very high levels of regional inequality in this country. Those levels of regional equality will be made worse by the pandemic and by Brexit. Brexit will hit those areas that the COVID hits, and they will be the areas that are already falling behind in terms of the picture for the national economy. One of the paradoxes of Brexit is that the two parts of the United Kingdom that are least exposed to trade with the European Union, so the two parts of the United Kingdom that will be least badly damaged by a significant fall in trade with the European Union, are London and Scotland. which happen to be the two parts of the United Kingdom that voted most strongly to remain. So actually there is a sort of correlation between how strongly a region voted to leave and how badly impacted its economy will be by the economics of Brexit going forward. That's going to be an interesting dilemma for the Prime Minister to solve, given that the Conservative vote now, 82% of the people who voted Conservative at the last election were Leave voters. So the Conservative vote is basically a Leave coalition now. So the Prime Minister has to figure out a way to deliver to Leave voters whose regions will be disproportionately badly hit by the impact of Brexit in the first place. So as a final word, if this hasn't depressed you all enough to be going on with, Brexit isn't going to go away even if we get a deal on the 1st of January, because we are going to be living with its consequences for a decade or more, both economically and politically. Can I leave it at that? Is that okay?
Great, thank you, and you know, it's a cheery Christmas message you have there for us, and I think probably most of us are kind of aligned with that thinking. I think here, as you heard yesterday from Mayor Steve Rotherham, we kind of pretty firmly Remainers in this part of the world. Cities tended to be that way inclined, but we were largely Remainers in this part of the world, and certainly that's a big part of the business community. We're firmly in that space. But what we'll do now is go to some questions. I want to give everybody the chance to ask a question. The first one we've got in the group chat, which I will ask on Les McRae's behalf, is you've obviously talked about a lot of the downsides of no deal. Any potential economical business upsides of no deal, Anand?
Yeah, I mean, if we end up with no deal, the government is free to splash the cash in terms of subsidies. So if you're in a sector that the government has prioritised going forward, you might end up with far more investment and far more incentives than otherwise. Bear in mind, there's not all that much cash left now because of the impact of the pandemic. I've always thought the argument about state aid was a curious one. The British government wanted the right to invest loads of money, but it was never entirely clear where that money was coming from. But I would suggest that if you work in an area in any way related to the climate agenda, you might see some opportunities going forward out of a no-deal Brexit, because that's the kind of area where the government, I think, is going to be trying to provide incentives and investment for companies. The other broader point I would make is, I think, you know, the referendum and its aftermath have changed the political geography of the United Kingdom. Because I think one of the implications of Brexit is that parts of the country that haven't had government attention or government money for decades, you know, I think about my own part of the country, which is West Yorkshire, which have basically been ignored by government since the miners' strike, are suddenly now, for a variety of reasons, one, because of the result of the referendum, two, because actually there are Conservative MPs in marginal seats there now. So Wakefield has a Conservative MP, and I suspect that Wakefield will do rather better out of this government as a result of that than it would have done. You look at how the government is spending the money from the town's funds, there's a curious correlation between where that money is going and where the Tories have MPs. I think that one of the things that the last 4 years have done is they've forced government to think about parts of the country that they have completely and utterly ignored for ages. And that could be a good thing. The counterfactual here isn't a world where we didn't do Brexit and people were investing in the north. The counterfactual is, if Cameron had won the referendum, 10 more years of Cameron and Osborne and 10 more years of austerity. So if you're in Workington, right, and you compare that world of 10 more years of austerity in Cameron and Osborne and further cuts versus this world where you have a prime minister who talks about Workington and might invest in Workington, you can easily make the argument that actually Workington is going to do better out of this, whatever the aggregate impact of Brexit on the national economy, than it would have done under a larger national economy under Cameron and Osborne, where none of the proceeds went to you. So distributionally, I think it's going to be really interesting going forward. And I think parts of the country might do better than they otherwise would have done. But as a whole, the size of the aggregate economy will be less than it would have been had we done a different sort of Brexit.
Great. Yes, thank you. I'm going to reach out to a few folks, some old friends, and perhaps a few new faces. Neil Sturmey, you're usually one of the first to come forward in our sessions, and incredibly well informed. Neil Sturmey from Grant Thornton. Any sort of thoughts or concerns that are exercising you and all the clients that you represent in our region, Neil?
I think a lot of the concerns are exactly what Anand said, and in particular, having a lot of food clients not even knowing what labels to put on their goods. It's massive, not even hidden costs, there'd be actual costs. So I think the generality of what Anand said is reflected in all the client conversations I'm having. It's a bit depressing, really, isn't it? On the sort of other side of things, I suppose things that are going on locally, like potential freeports, are interesting. So a question, I guess, would be, what does Anand think of that as a concept? And will that help forge different trade relationships with other parts of the world that might just help the Liverpool City region?
I mean, I can do sort of two Neils, because like there's a question from another Neil in the chat, which is about the same thing. So yeah, there are opportunities for Western ports. There is economic evidence actually to suggest that there was a displacement effect of joining the European Union, that business left the Western ports and traveled to the southeast, that there was a sort of displacement activity going on because of the impact of joining the European Union, because it redirected our trade towards Europe rather than towards the rest of the world. Because this government has got such a global trade agenda, I think there are real possibilities for the Port of Liverpool, for instance, if they make good on that. Bear in mind, there are two buts, okay? One but is we are entering an age of protectionism, where there's going to be less global trade, partly because of politics. You might have a Democrat president in the United States, but he's not going to embrace globalization because he needs to keep those Midwestern voters. And partly because of COVID. There's a sort of desire to be more self-sufficient going forward because of the pandemic. People want to secure supplies of stuff. They want to make sure that supply chains are less vulnerable. So we don't know what's going to happen to global trade going forward, but I would be surprised if global trade got back to the levels it was at immediately pre-pandemic, because of politics and because of the suspicion that the pandemic has given rise to. So they're the buts. Now, on Freeport specifically, what I would say is there is no economic evidence that Freeports generate wealth. There is some evidence that Freeports relocate economic activity. So what I would say is, whilst I don't see any economic point to Freeports as a country, I think if the government has decided to create Freeports and is leaving them up to bids from around the country, you'd be stupid in Liverpool not to bid for one. It makes utter sense to get any investment that's going from the government. And because Rishi Sunak has this curious sort of personal attachment to the idea of Freeports, despite what everyone in the Treasury says to him, it has to be said, then it will happen, and there'll be some cash attached to it, because Rishi Sunak's a smart politician who realizes if he launches a scheme, he's got to make sure it works. So my answer is contradictory. Liverpool should definitely go for a Freeport because they're there to be had, but I don't think they actually make a whole load of difference to the country as a whole.
Yes, thanks, Alan. And yeah, that interestingly, that issue came up yesterday, and there's a few folks on this call. I'm thinking you, Colin, and others who are interested in that debate and what it could or could not do for our city region. Just picking up perhaps the second half of Neil Roscoe's question there about are we going to face particular complications with the island border on the with the either no deal or the possibly thin deal that might be agreed?
Yeah, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. The Irish are busy trying to develop direct routes from the Republic to the European Union that don't come through us. Remember, one of the problems that the Irish have is that so many of their exports to the EU come via the UK. That they now see as a vulnerability. So traders in Northern Ireland are going to be trying to find alternative ways of trading with the European Union that don't involve going via us. That'll be one of the phenomena we see, actually. And it's one of the phenomena you see just in sort of vox pops from the continent already. People saying, well, I don't care whether they're accused or not trading with the UK. Why would I take the risk? You know, the widget that I get from Birmingham, I can get from Slovakia. Or the widget I sell to Birmingham, I can sell to Slovakia. So people are making contingencies now to try and trade round us rather than with us. And the Irish will do that too. Now, obviously, geography is geography, and it's not easy for the Irish to do that. And there still will be some incentive to trade through us. But as ever, the larger the barriers, the higher the costs, the longer the delays, the harder people will try to find alternatives to trading with or via the UK land bridge. So yeah, there is a real issue here with trade with Northern Ireland and the Republic. Remember that they've had to put in place all sorts of short-term mitigations in the functioning of the Northern Ireland Protocol because supermarkets were up in arms. Supermarkets at one point this year were engaged in a serious conversation about whether or not they shouldn't just close in Northern Ireland because it wasn't worth their while to get their products over there. Pharma companies were doing exactly the same thing. Both sectors have received a sort of mitigation saying in the short term, we're not going to apply those rules. So your sausages, your burgers will not be checked. Eventually they will be. And that's going to have massive repercussions. It might have repercussions in terms of price in Northern Ireland. It might have repercussions in terms of who's willing to send goods to Northern Ireland. We don't know how it's going to work out. What we do know is ultimately the European Union will apply the letter of the law. And the law in the terms of the protocol are that stuff is going to have to be checked going in. I should add that the messaging from the government, I mean, there are two things that horrified me. Firstly, that businesses are, whatever date we are, 11th of December, sat here not knowing the terms of trade with the European Union in 3 weeks' time. I mean, just saying that out loud underlines how preposterous the situation we're in really is. But the second thing is that the government has compounded this with basically untrue messaging. How many people in Northern Ireland have simply not prepared for paperwork because the Prime Minister assured them in terms unambiguously that there wouldn't be any? You know, this time last year was when the Prime Minister was caught on film saying to Northern Ireland businesses, there won't be any paperwork, and if anyone gives you paperwork, I suggest you throw it in the bin. How does that help people prepare? The other point of that, the government messaging that irritates me, let me get this off my chest now, you're now my therapists, is by coming out with a message, get ready for Brexit, it'll be great, which is essentially the messaging government came out with, if you remember back in March with the first Get Ready for Brexit campaign. What they did was subliminally gave businesses the idea that, oh, this is all about opportunities, that's good. Rather than the message should have been, look, Brexit will be great eventually, but in the short term, even if we get a deal, you lot are going to have an utter nightmare. You're going to have to learn to fill in new forms. You're going to have to get stuff certified in not only in the United Kingdom, but in your destination country. You're going to have to figure out rules in 27 European countries, because quite often you're dealing with national jurisdictions rather than the EU if you're not bound with the treaty of the European Union. Businesses didn't take it seriously because government never made it clear how serious this is. And it was only about a month and a half ago, I think, when Michael Gove went to the House of Commons looking for the first time I've ever known him, seriously panicked and said, businesses aren't preparing. We need to get the message across. So I think government carries quite a lot. It doesn't help you lot, I realise that, but government has not helped businesses by not getting the message across, not being clear, and not actually getting to a point where it can tell you what you need to be preparing for even now.
No, I think we recognise that, and it's really interesting that, you know, in the spending review, the government has put some extra money to try and get this awareness raising campaign, you know, out through growth hubs, and we're working with our local chambers to try and do that, as the chambers are often a first port of call for many businesses. But it's extraordinarily late in the day. I've a number of chamber colleagues around the room at the moment. Tracy in St Helens, and it was Neil, we've heard from you. Just wonder, any chamber colleagues have any observations, because you are in the front line of supporting businesses, what you're hearing and the concerns that you're getting, and anything you might want to ask or convey to Anand or the rest of the group. Tracy, you've gone on to you've unmuted yourself, so I suspect you're going to speak.
Well, I'm happy to. I mean, I think it's a tricky one, really. The question that was in my mind was back actually on something that Anand said earlier on, which is more about sort of political willingness to invest in areas of the country that are badly impacted by the two things that we're living through, both Brexit and COVID. And I suppose my question is really that what we're seeing in terms of that investment is it's all very short term.
Yep.
It's all very, very competitive, in that if you do get some money, it's because you've had to bid for it and then you have to get it spent by March. And I don't get any sense really that government is thinking long term in terms of economic development, regeneration, levelling up agenda, high growth agenda, any of these things. It's all so short term, and that doesn't help with impact on the ground. That doesn't help with capacity building on the ground, or a strategic agenda. So my question's not really about you've said it, the business response to Brexit is just that the whole thing is impossible to deal with because they don't know anything about it. But my question, I suppose, is looking at our local area here, is where is the government response in terms of a much more stable and medium term sort of investment strategy to try and do that levelling up agenda? I can't see it at the moment. Have you picked up any sense that they are thinking in that way? Is there any sensible heads in government, or is it just all incredibly politically driven and reactive and around the political agenda?
It is the most political government I've ever come across. I mean, I remember going into number 10 in December. So you remember the world before the pandemic, and they'd won their election victory and they were preparing for these great plans. And the only thing that people would talk about was re-election in 2024. I've never come across a government that was so focused on the political and the electoral. I mean, I know they all think it at some point, but this is what they were thinking about then. So there is a very political aspect to it. This is also a government, and maybe that's just a function of the pandemic and they'll come out of it and be different, but this is a government for whom strategic means planning for 5 o'clock today. Doesn't mean for planning for months or years in advance. Everything is very, very, very short-termist. If you think about it, you think about some of the things they've done during the pandemic. So one of the lines that this government has had is we've put too much emphasis on higher education. We need to prioritise further education, skills-based training, apprenticeships, vocational stuff. All that makes perfect sense to me. Halfway through the pandemic, what happens? There's a cock-up over A-levels, and the government basically sanctions an enormous increase in university education. That works for today, but in terms of your medium-term objectives, it flies in the face of what you've already said. Equally, this government has said Britain is going to be the forefront of technology. We're going to be, world leaders in new technologies, in AI and all those sorts of things. In the pandemic, what happens? People start working from home, relying on technology. You could think about that in the context of a broader technology strategy, but no, the government panics and says, hang on a sec, we need Pret to survive. Get back to work, everyone. Get back into the office as quickly as you can. So there's a complete mismatch between the sort of knee-jerk short-termism, which maybe, as I said, is because the pandemic is unlike anything else. And maybe I'm being unfair, and in a year's time, they'll prove to be better. But at the moment, everything is short-term. I think it is unconscionable that 4 years on from the referendum, the Shared Prosperity Fund isn't up and running. We knew in 2016 we'd need something to replace cohesion and structural funding. We knew we'd have to devise it, we'd have to figure out a way to give it out, we'd have to figure out a way to prioritise people. It is still stuck in Robert Jenrick's office mainly, waiting to figure out what will happen to it. Everything is slow, everything is delayed, everything is reactive. And I don't see that changing in the near term, because there is too much of the pandemic stuff going on. There is too much politics going on. The notion that this government is going to come up with a long-term plan for levelling up strikes me as fanciful. The other thing I will say is levelling up does not mean giving power, responsibility and resources to people on the ground in local areas. This is also a massively centralising government. This government's view of levelling up is that Boris will send you a little Christmas box with love from Boris on it, with a few quid for your local area, but there'll be no partnerships. There'll be no sort of saying, and I suspect actually, it's an interesting question. You can invite me back in 6 months and see if I'm totally wrong. I think if Andy Street loses in the mayoral election in May, what little appetite there is for devolution in this government will disappear altogether, because ultimately cities are Labour strongholds, and devolving power to strong city leaders or city region leaders who will all be Labour politicians is not on the agenda of this government. So I don't think you can level up a country. I don't think you can level up a country in less than 3 or 4 decades anyway. This is a long-term thing. But I think if you're going to do it, you have to do it in partnership with strong local and regional leaders. And I just don't think the government's got the appetite to do that.
Thank you, Anand. Your views there, I think, very strongly aligned with ours in this space. And we have seen the emergence in the city region. I think everyone on this call will acknowledge a real strong leadership from the Metro Mayor, Steve Rotham, and other political leaders in taking some very difficult decisions. And kind of in response to Diane Weeks' question, is this short-term planning filtering down into the local authorities, leaving vulnerable people missing out, and cash spent? That's absolutely happening, and we know that our local authorities have been hollowed out financially, not just in the short term, but over a number of years, and that does denude their ability to respond in the way that we're trying to, which is by taking, in answer to Tracy's question, a much more strategic, medium to long-term approach, which we think is needed. Though we've got 10 minutes or so left.
And it's worth just stressing that point, isn't it? We're coming off the back of 10 years of austerity where local services have been stripped to the bone. And actually, that applies across the board. If you look at, it's always struck me as weird that one of the COVID messages was protect the NHS, because it always struck me that the NHS was there to protect us rather than vice versa. And one of the reasons we had to protect the NHS was because the NHS too had been stripped back to the bone. And, if you look at differences between this country and others, and you try and account for our higher excess mortality rate, one of the reasons is, as a deliberate matter of policy, people were hospitalized much later in this country. If you went in with the early signs of COVID in this country, they'd send you home and say, you'll be fine. And if it gets a lot worse, come back. Whereas in France and Germany, they'd hospitalize you straight away. And the early evidence suggests that's one of the reasons why we have differential excess mortality. And that's because there is far more excess capacity built into health services in France and Germany than there is here, where we do things by the skin of our teeth. Can I just say on the Amazon thing, yes, Amazon are the winners already from the pandemic. Whether they're the winners in the medium term will be interesting, because of what's happening in the United States at the moment is really interesting, with what the US government is doing with Facebook, with the antitrust investigation into Facebook. If that marks a sea change in the attitude of the United States towards the tech giants, then you might see something global happening, which might involve more stringent measures to tax firms like Amazon, in at least something approaching a fair way. But for the moment, yeah, Amazon are sweeping all before them.
Okay, I'd like to bring in. I just wonder if Barry Miller, whether Barry, you, HSBC, probably our most prominent global banking partner, certainly with a big presence in the city region. Just any thoughts from you and the corporate clients that you represent, Barry?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I suppose that the big thing for me talking to customers is there's just a lot of fear and confusion, and I think that's only going to get worse after the 1st of January. So we're constantly trying to encourage businesses to have more confidence, to improve import and exporting channels, and I think this is just going to counter some of those good efforts that were made in recent years. And I suppose my question for you, Anand, is what happens next? So we're heading for this precipice on Sunday, Monday, but what happens after that in terms of the political negotiations that happen? So what can we expect next year in terms of what's the next step? Are we going to get some further clarity in terms of how we can guide customers and what to expect, and what are the milestones we should look out for?
If there's a deal, or if there isn't a deal.
Regardless, I think if there's not a deal, then what's the next step in terms of what do we look out for?
I think you and your customers are going to be in a situation of sort of learning by doing. I think by the time the deal is out and it's clear and whatever, it's going to be January, and there's Christmas, and you're not going to spend your time reading. I imagine none of you are going to read the treaty on Christmas Day, but it's going to be long, it's going to be detailed, there's going to be hideous stuff in there that won't become apparent you'll learn as it happens. No one, the idea that we can prepare now is just wrong. We can't. you're either prepared or you're not. The big multinationals are prepared. Most of them are prepared by opening up offices inside the European Union to get around the regulatory hurdles. For smaller firms that can't do that, then I can't give you advice. I mean, even if the government came out on Tuesday with a set of detailed guidance saying this is how you prepare for the new terms of trade with the European Union, would you be able to do it? No, there's no time. Most things are going to be shut for a period over Christmas anyway. So I think we're just going to have to ride the shot in January. It might be that it looks less damaging than it. This is where it's a lose-lose. If there isn't chaos at the ports in January and tailbacks, it is because loads of people who would normally have been trading across the short straits have taken the decision not to. So either the economic hit is coming early or there's chaos at the ports. That's your choice. And people are just going to have to learn. I don't think this can be done in an anticipatory way anymore. And just while I'm on it, on the data thing, which is another area that is a mess, you're absolutely right. Formally, there is no link between the Brexit negotiations and the adequacy decision. Politically, of course there is. They're not going to walk away from the table with no deal and say, oh yeah, let's give them adequacy. I mean, the French and the Italians can be like, sod off. If our aim is to punish them and get them back to the negotiating table, we tighten the noose. We don't loosen the noose. And of course, adequacy is obviously a very, very big deal for companies in terms of client lists, in terms of digital trade, all that sort of stuff. But don't forget what I said earlier. It's also massively important in areas like policing, counterterrorism, the fight against organized crime. Data is a very, very big deal. And like so much in this process, it's something we just haven't talked about enough.
Just probably time for a couple more contributions. Elaine, you've been sitting very quietly and patiently there. You've normally got lots to say and lots to add into these sorts of things. Anything from a sort of further education perspective?
Thanks, Mark. It's been really good to listen to you, Anand. Really good. I don't know is the simple answer. I think that's the discussion that's going on with us nationally in terms of how this will impact on skills. I think it's going to be bad, quite frankly. I can't see how it can't be bad for us, and I can't see how we'll be able to deliver what's going to be needed in the short term and the medium term because of the differences in terms of skills and that globalization. I think the globalization issue that was mentioned earlier will be a massive impact on skills. I don't think the government's doing anything to really prepare for that, in addition to the fact that the pandemic has already impacted on skills as well. So we've got a short term, a medium term and a long term issue. And we're getting a few crumbs thrown at the table around skills.
I mean, the further education investment is welcome, but it's trivial. And it's obviously not part of a longer term plan in terms of thinking about skills, particularly thinking about things like education levels in more deprived areas, questions of brain drain that haunt our economy. There is no joined up pattern of thinking about that. I mean, one interesting thing that Wes Streeting said on Question Time last night that I hadn't realised because he's Shadow Education Minister is that schools got a letter from the Education Secretary a couple of weeks ago telling them to guarantee their supply chains so that they can keep feeding their kids. So that, they could make sure that they could get fresh food in for the new year. This was sent out to every single head, apparently. So there are layers upon layers of this. I mean, in a sense, the paradox here is that the Eurosceptics were right. The EU impinges on all sorts of aspects of our life that you wouldn't have thought, and it's very, very intrusive indeed. But because they were right, leaving it is a nightmare. Because it's so intrusive, because it gets into so many of the sort of nooks and crannies of national life, it's going to be months into next year, and we're still going to be learning about stuff that we're having to adapt to because, oh my God, there was a European bit there, and we can't do that anymore in the same way that we used to. I remember sort of halfway through this process, I went and had a coffee with David Lidington when he was leader of the House of Commons. And he's a nice bloke, David. He had in a corner of his office, he had a whiteboard. And on it, there's scrawls. And I said, what's that? And he said, that's where we write down the bits of legislation we suddenly realise we're going to need to cope when we leave, because the list just keeps on getting longer. And every now and again, someone will say, oh my God, we can't do that without legislation to allow us to do it. And I think it's going to be like that for all of us, going forward is that stuff you might have taken for granted, might suddenly become a bit more difficult. I mean, whether that is going on holiday and you're in the non-EU channel and the line's enormous, or the fact that you get to the passport guy in the end and they don't let you in because you haven't got 6 months validity, which we're going to need from the 1st of January on your passport to travel to Europe, or whether it's because you've got a home in Spain and you want to go there for 6 months and someone tells you you can't, you can only go for 90 days at a stretch anymore because we're now outside the European. I mean, from basic stuff about day-to-day life to far more sort of economically impactful stuff about how businesses do things, lots and lots and lots of things are going to change.
Very sobering.
GB sticker, absolutely. You need your GB sticker now. You also need an international driving permit.
Asif, anything you want to say to sort of as we wrap up? We're going to close down the next couple of minutes, so just perhaps leave the sort of final sort of thoughts or questions to you.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Anand, because I think one of the things just to put across, I think that the schedule that he's got and to give us the time today. So thank you very much for Anand. I think, for us,
my days are so crap that this counts as fun.
Thanks, Anand. It's better than question time after yesterday, I think.
Anything's better than question time. Just leaves me scarred.
But I have to say, our idea was to try and get Anand here earlier on in the year, but obviously time permitted. But one of the things we are going to look to do is to do through Anand and a couple of other people to specify certain areas of business. And I think, Caroline, yesterday we had a meeting with the leaders, so we're going to be doing some more further areas to talk about Brexit and try and get Anand back in the new year. But as you can probably see, for business, the uncertainty is a killer. We plan months in advance, so it's still nobody knows what's going to happen better. I think, I was a little bit, just one of the points Anand picked up on travel yesterday, and I started to look at it for our business, is the one about, actually, if you've got a violin player, Anand, going into Europe, he's got to get a pass for some of his goods as well. Is that right?
You've got to get your violin certified because it's a work implement. You've got to get a visa for yourself. You can't just do things at short notice, and you can't just pop to France at short notice to work in the way you used to be able to.
Which will have a major impact, I feel, in some areas of business. But generally, we're looking to try and get as much insight as possible as we can do, by getting people like Anand who have got the knowledge and the ability to sort of talk to us. But I personally just want to thank each and every one of you who's working in these uncertain times with COVID and Brexit, really. So I think it's a difficult transition at the moment. Mark?
Yeah, thanks Asif, to echo those thanks, and thanks to everyone who's joined the call and asked questions either through the chat or in person, or just politely listened. What it gives for me is just a really candid insight. It's unfortunately we don't hear enough of this. We're fed the sort of the political or politicized sort of debate around EU exit and what it's going to mean. I think we've heard some very hard and clear messages, and the big takeaway for me is, I think you're absolutely right, and we're going to have to learn by doing. That's what businesses do a lot of the time, if we're honest, particularly small businesses. They do an awful lot of learning by doing. Yeah. And I think those of us who look to support businesses, as obviously we do, I think we have to be there to help to support them and guide them and give them some resource where we can during that learning by doing phase over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months or so.
One of the really interesting things I've come across is, because the Federation of Small Businesses membership was sort of split down the middle, 50-50 on Brexit, they felt very constrained in terms of the advice they could give about the impact of Brexit. Because if they started giving out that honest advice, then half their membership would say, you're just Project Fear, what sort of thing. So, I mean, in a sense, to Ben's question, this division is going to run and run now. This was a sort of identity division in British politics. It's not just going to disappear because we've left the European Union. People will continue to see the world through a Brexit lens. So people who voted, so one of the things you see now from survey work, people who voted leave think the British economy is flourishing at the moment. People who voted remain think the British economy is doing very badly at the moment. That will continue to be a lens through which people interpret the world going forward. There's a massive overlap between the lockdown skeptics and the Brexit ultras in the Parliamentary Conservative Party. So this division just keeps manifesting itself in slightly different ways on an ongoing basis. So I'm sorry, Ben, I'd love to be able to say, don't worry, give it 6 months, we'll all be mates again. I just don't think it's going to be that easy, to be honest.
On that happy,
sorry,
on that happy note, is there anything you can say to cheer us up? A final farewell.
Beat West Ham, 8 o'clock.
Well, that's it. We've relied on football for many years in this city region to try and cheer us up. It was incredibly important in the 1980s and kept many of us going. And well, it's hopefully it'll do the same for
well, if I can also make you feel better, just in case you're thinking that I've got loads of Christmas presents, I'm a judge on a political book prize, and they're sodding books that have got to be read by February. So it's not Santa at all, sadly.
Okay, well, Anand, thanks again for making the time available to us. Hugely valuable. In the conversation we had yesterday, I know there's some of your team have been doing some brilliant work around manufacturing, around Freeports, and you're going to share some of that material with us that we can cascade out to folks. So again, on behalf of everyone on the call, everyone at the LEP and Growth platform, thank you so much for your time. Thanks everyone for joining, and stay safe and have a good Christmas.
Oh, and happy Christmas.
Yeah, take care, Anand. Thanks a lot.
See you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.